What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Thinking CAAP. I'm Beck Moore, CEO of Community Action Association of Pennsylvania. With me today, fearless co-host Heather Holloway, Holloway Media Services. What's up, Heather? Wah, 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 wah.
Oh, you took the right out of my mouth.
I know. I had it planned all week.
You knew it. You saw a little light bulb go, and then, I mean,
just preparing for the microphone.
If you don't believe telepathy is a thing, it's a thing. It happened real time. Hey, look, I'm there's no better place to be right now than on the Thinking CAAP podcast. Thank you so much, Beck.
Absolutely happy to be here. Also with us today are two amazing guests, Vanessa Philbert and Kristy Aurand. I'm going to let them both introduce themselves, tell us a little bit about them, their backgrounds, what they do with Lancaster Community Action Programs, one of our amazing partner member agencies serving Lancaster County. So Vanessa, I'm going to start with you. Sure. Share a little bit about your background, who you are, what you do, what you care about.
Oh, that feels like a loaded question these days. So my name is Vanessa Philbert. I'm the CEO of our local community action partnership in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. What do I do every day? That's a good question. These days, it's a lot of trying to keep things moving along. Really, our work at Community Action, like many of you know who are listening, is to create an environment where our neighbors can thrive. And we do that through different models, modalities, services, convening around economic mobility efforts. A little bit about me: born and raised Brooklyn, New York. Don't be mad about that, Beck. He was like,
I was born in Kentucky. Don't be mad about that.
Oh, okay, that's fair. And been here in Lancaster for over 20 years. Glad to be a part of the community, and have been here at CAAP almost 9 years now. So glad to be part of the CAAP team.
Thank you very much. And just for the record, I will say to everyone, including you, Heather, Vanessa is technically one of my bosses because she is on the CAAP board as our vice chair of our board. So just will, be on my best behavior. Maybe we'll see.
We'll
best behavior.
We'll add this to his evaluation, and it'll be great.
This is true. And then Kristy Aurand, who's also joining us from Lancaster CAAP, which we typically say, Heather, I don't know if I've said this to you, we are CAAP and this is Lancaster CAAP. Kristy, I think, coined that phrase, though. So, Kristy, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Oh, yeah. So I'm Kristy Aurand. I'm the Chief Development Officer at Community Action Partnership of Lancaster. So I'm responsible for fundraising, marketing, communications, public relations and media relations. Really anything that would earn us $1 or earn us a friend kind of falls under my purview. And I've been with CAAP just a little over 8 years, and really value the work of the org and the direction we're heading.
Awesome. Well, thank you both for spending time with us and talking a little bit about a project that you embarked on 2 years ago. Is that right? A year ago? When did this work start around language justice, which is what we're here to talk about today?
Yeah, about a year and a half ago. So you let's split the difference between where you were at.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah.
Well, so I think let's kind of jump right into this. And we've had, I know that the three of us, Heather, you haven't been included in all those conversations in the past, but I know we've had a lot of conversations about sort of the evolution of what economic mobility looks like, right? How we talk about the work of our organizations. And part of what's really, for our audience, I think for those of you who are within community action, you know this already, but for those of you who don't, if you've been listening along, hopefully you started to remember this. But the work of community action is really, helping people, changing lives. It's sort of our motto and our tagline. But how each agency does that, how they approach, local community is very different. But I think with you, Vanessa, and in Lancaster, you all have taken really intentional approaches around, things like words that you are using, this idea of language justice. And so really excited to kind of dig into this topic with you all. So I want to start let's kind of create a grounding moment here, right? Around this idea. Let's get to the basics, right? What is language justice? Why is it important? So question for either one of you. You tell me who wants to answer it, but let's just talk about really what does that mean?
Yeah, I can.
I'll let Kristy do the official definition.
So, official definition probably talks about a framework, right, for ensuring that everyone has a right to communicate and to be understood in their preferred language or in the preferred language, with which we speak. So a lot of times I think language justice can refer to simply translation, which is obviously something that's super important, especially across the participants that we serve with community action. And I think as we think about it, language can really create a barrier and can be pretty oppressive. So here at Lancaster CAAP, we look at language and language justice specifically as really a tool for social and racial justice, especially as we think about things like person-first language or eliminating bias from either terms or phrases or whatever it might be. So that's sort of like general broad definition as it's understood, and then kind of like a little more focused on like what we're thinking about here internally.
So when I think about what that means tactically, yeah, Heather, were you gonna bring this up?
Go ahead. I'll jump in. I'm so excited about this. I'll jump in.
So when I think about this tactically then, right, I think about it from the context of if I am trying to figure out where I could best be served, or I'm trying to reach out to somebody and I go to someone's website, right, and I see words that immediately make me feel othered or different or minimized, or looks like, they're, even thinking about like the pictures that people use on websites, or, how to market out services. And I feel like this is a place I don't belong. To me, that is a barrier to then the equity that ultimately community action is trying to create. Fair?
For sure.
Fair. Yeah, I think it's like when I work through the summary of it, it's like it creates access, it creates inclusion. I think it doesn't I think it creates an environment of respect. And ultimately, it helps us to make sure that we're creating a space where equity and justice feel like is kind of happening in real time with people. But it does take a lot of intentionality, because there's a way that we can start with something, what feels maybe basic, like translation services, and then consider how do we stretch ourselves to do more, to really close the gap for folks and to make sure that they feel welcome and, ready. When you're working through the things that we offer people, you're trying to navigate lots of stuff in the world. And, it's challenging to consider one more barrier to just understanding information, to getting what you need. So just feeling like I'm ready, I can do this thing, I think helps our participants get what they need.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, go back to kind of the why, and then Heather, I'll be quiet so you can make sure to make your point. What I don't think a lot of people understand about Lancaster County is it's actually one of the most diverse populations in the entire state. And when I think about Lancaster County, until I having had worked there at some point in my career nonprofit for even a short period of time, I know that now. But before, when I think about Lancaster County, the perspective is just, it may not be that for people. So interesting fun fact for folks to kind of look up and dig into a little bit about what that really means. Heather, go ahead. I want to be quiet for a minute.
No. It's wonderful. I love this. I did not know that this is the subject we were getting into today. Language for me and in my agency carries so much weight. It has so much power. It holds, you can rise up or you can crash down, right? And so even in my agency, we take language so seriously. And I teach this when I speak to social workers that, this killing and crushing and blowing up the chat, even words like that, we must be mindful because it carries an energy. So beyond language and translation, it's like you said, getting away from these cliches. And being more inviting and positive with our language. I love it. I love that you guys are doing this. Thank you for being leaders in this.
It's one of the things, Heather, ever since, we had a conversation a while ago and we were talking about this, and you had mentioned about, right, like bullet pointed emails and not saying bullet pointed emails. And ever since you said that, I'm so cognizant of saying that phrase and trying to avoid it. But it's just some of these words and phrases, and we're going to talk about this, right, are just so built into our vernacular that
sure. It's conditioning.
We have to retrain our brains.
Absolutely. And it is. You do. It's a choice. You have to make an active choice. So I love that you're taking action and providing that so that it feels accessible and open and you guys are magnetic. It's awesome.
So want to kind of unbox a little bit about the process. If you can walk us through. So in 2024, I think, you all started partnering with the Wakeman agency to develop this organizational sort of vocabulary, lexicon, however you want to describe it. Can you walk us through a little bit about what the process looked like? And ultimately, we've talked a little bit about the why, but anything in particular that you haven't shared that motivated really the decision?
Yeah, I mean, it was really interesting because we had a discussion actually at our board meeting 1 month focused on the word empowering. And it came from our board member who is a professor at a local university. And so her understanding of the term and conversations that were happening at the university were very academic based, right? Super based in academia. And so almost so far as to be well, I don't know how that really relates to us. And yet we were sitting there with our tagline, our organizational tagline being empowering Lancaster County families. And so I think it really gave us pause to think we should probably think about this a little further. Right. And so we kind of went back as a leadership team and had some conversations here and there. And I think what we really deduced from that is right, when you think about the word empower, there is a power dynamic that is baked in to the word empower. Whereas with empowering Lancaster County families, it was us doing the empowering of the families. And actually we can get to the word families in a little bit because that's also sometimes problematic. But, with empowering, it really suggests we are in power and the folks who are coming to us are going to somehow get this power from us. Excuse me. But what we know, I'm getting too excited about it. But what we know is, everyone who walks through our doors already has everything that they need within themselves, all of the qualities, all of the, resources that they intrinsic that they need. There's just, a reason, whatever the reason is that they're coming to us for some extra, resource. And so it's not we're not doing the empowering. They're already empowered. So it was just a very interesting, series of conversations on okay, so what does that mean? So fast forward, it was probably ad nauseum conversations, but, we switched to our tagline, which feels like a very small thing, but is actually pretty monumental. We switched it to people, period, empowered, period. And really the point behind that is we want everyone to be empowered, whether that's families coming through the doors, whether that's our staff, whether that's our partners, whether that's our board, but everyone who touches Community Action Partnership of Lancaster County, we want them to be empowered. And we are an organization that is just based in the fact that people are empowered already. So that was kind of light bulb of the motivation behind deciding to think about language. The process itself, we had kind of come to learn about the Wakeman agency at a fundraising conference and kind of learned about this lexicon project that they had trademarked and, sounded really interesting and decided to make the investment in it. But I mean, over the course of, a year's time, they did, a whole intake meeting to go over our goals and just set expectations. They did interviews with our staff and our board. They did focus groups. They did an all staff survey. They reviewed almost 30 documents from our organization, including our website. We talked about this project at our all staff meeting. So it was a lengthy engagement and a lot of work on both sides. But we really came out of the process with not just understanding of words and language, but also a lot about organizational culture and, how the culture can be improved, not just through language, but really just through general findings that they came out with staff surveys.
And I think for anybody who's listening is like, okay, this seems like it's way too high level, or it's over my head, or someone's like, like, I still don't get it. I think here's the thing, and I want you to remember, and I want you to stick with us through this conversation, because I can appreciate, I know some people who are probably listening are probably skeptics to why this really matters, but I think it may not matter to you, but it matters to somebody, right? And so I think you need to consider that, again, right, this to you doesn't necessarily matter for whatever reason, but it's going to matter for somebody that's walking through your doors. And so it's part of, again, right, like at our core within community action, us thinking about the impact that we are making on people in the really big ways, in the really small ways, and in the ways in between that we don't even understand sometimes.
Well, and I think language is one of those things where sometimes it doesn't matter until it really, really matters.
Yes. Exactly my
and
point.
I think that, like you had said earlier, Beck, if folks are not coming to us because they feel they are not seen or represented or, otherwise, or if, as in conversation, we're causing harm, those are like, especially with community action, like we're based in, creating respect and dignity and, walking with folks. And so I think, again, it's like, it doesn't have to be, I think, it doesn't have to be a process like this one. It can maybe just be being a little more thoughtful. It can be having curious conversations. So I think there's a lot of different entry points.
Yeah, for sure.
I would say, I think what was helpful too is that probably 2 years prior to that, we went through another kind of learning as a whole organization, and it started with our mindset. So if I was giving any advice to folks about how do you kind of create readiness to an organization to explore something like, a project around language, it starts with how we think about ourselves. It starts with how we think about the folks that we are in service to. It starts with grappling with our own bias and how those things show up, which often show up in the way that we describe, talk about, deal with, decompress about the work. So we spent, probably 2 years working through this mindset, kind of framework with an organization called the Prosperity Agenda. And they were great, but it was very similar in terms of let's engage with your core team, like your whole organization, surveys, learning, focus groups, and then let's take them on a journey of learning. And then help them to start to self-identify where are the spaces in which these things are bubbling up for me, and where can we find common language, shared language to talk about the work, the participants, the challenges, the barriers, the opportunities, the gifts that people bring when they show up, at CAAP. So when we started to move into the language justice piece, we already had some muscle memory from that learning experience. I would say as an organizational leadership perspective, these are the kinds of things that do not feel important in terms of the day-to-day work, but they are foundational to the quality of work that we will produce. So you have to have the vision to say wow, there are 100 other things that we need to do. There are things that we're required to do. There's, all the things that, especially when you are working through contracts and grants and, you feel that pressure. We made a really intentional effort to say, we're going to build time and capacity to create space for learning. Then it was easier, I think, to introduce something like language justice because there was that muscle memory coming along. And for me, it felt like then we're scaling skills and competency with, as a team and an organization.
Yeah, so I want to dig into a little bit more about how you engaged some of the team. I know, Kristy, you kind of reflected on this a little bit, and I'm going to use the word stakeholder, but I know that this is a good example of a word that we're going to talk about. I'm going to note that out loud, and that will help me to remember to not use that word anymore, to be clear. But anything in particular in engaging the team and the various folks that you work with in community that was really the most surprising to you or the most impactful to you when you were going through this process? Anything in particular that really, you're just like, this was my aha moment? And
I think for me, just some of the conversations, especially when we did this at our all staff meeting and kind of kicked this off to our whole, to our 300 staff, who work here. We kind of did an exercise talking through, a couple terms for like, what do we call the folks who come to CAAP? So, because there are people in the agency who call them clients, there are people who call them customers, participants, neighbors, there's just all of these different terms. And so I think it was like, and then we had a share out of like, what terms do you use? What terms do you like? And it was really interesting because I think in that moment, I realized like, this is it's a diverse organization, even in, right, what folks are called, because an attorney at a domestic violence legal clinic is going to call the person that they're working with a client, because across the legal sphere, that's what they're called. She's not going to walk into court and be like, this is my neighbor. She's going to say, this is my client. The folks working in our utility program, the people coming to them are customers of UGI or PPL, and they're accessing a service. So that's who they are. So I think in that moment, I really realized like what we're not going to do is be the language police, because we can't do that. And what we're not going to do is say one size fits all across the org. What we can do is like good, better, best, right? So maybe, like if it's not a legal situation, like probably client isn't the word we want to lean into. Probably we want to move to something like participant that feels a little more like both sides, the person at CAAP and the people coming are, working together as, collaborators. Or, for our Crispus Attucks Community Center, it's a neighborhood center. Neighbor, that's a great one. They're not, I don't know that client is the best, word there, but I think that it's offering the thought process behind some of this. And like Vanessa had said, the intentionality of giving it thought and being able to address like, yeah, we do, carry power in different ways. And so how can we, create scenarios that are just more dignified for everyone, in the community.
Yeah, absolutely. So
This is just a phenomenal work. I'm just sitting here stunned. I'm so sorry. I'm like jaw drop. I'm fangirling over here, Beck. Fangirling.
Heather's watching the ping pong match right now. I'm just so curious about what's going to be said next. I want to kind of dig into this word stakeholder a little bit and talk about other language, any suggestions in particular or words or phrases that you've really specifically, I know you said you're not going to be the language police, and I appreciate that because, I think that for some folks, right, like I think there's sometimes these expectations when we talk about work like this, like when we talk about diversity and equity and inclusion work, which we're not even supposed to talk about anymore, and I want to be clear, the views of this podcast are the views of the individual people, not the views of the organization. And in my instance, right, in your all's instance at Lancaster CAAP, right, like totally different perspective. But I'm going to say that out loud. It's, we're not talking about any one particular grant source. I'm going to give that little bit of caveat. But a lot of times when we talk about this type of work, right, like immediately somebody hears the word bias and they're like, oh, I'm out. I'm not going to do this because immediately it makes me angry. It makes me annoyed. And so I appreciate this perspective of not being the language police, because I think when we tell people not to do things, it's sort of just fight or flight mode, right? We're like, nope, I'm going to do it anyway. So I appreciate that. But I want to talk a little bit more about these words specifically, right? That you've said, we're going to agree this is our cultural norm as an organization. We're no longer going to use this. Have you developed any of those words specifically? Have you said those? Any suggestions about words not to use?
Yes, and the glossary heading on these will not even necessarily be words not to use, but will be words suggested for retirement. Right. So, because that just feels more if like everyone, like you're going to make mistakes, or you're going to, like it's OK. But, these are ones that we would suggest that we retire. So stakeholder is a great example. I mean, you think about we probably hear this word at least, multiple times a day.
It's ingrained in my brain. I just think about it. I'd say it all the time. So need to not use
As you think about it, that word originates in a colonial practice of putting a stake in the ground and saying, this is mine, right? Oftentimes not in a way that includes whose ever land it was beforehand. So just a good thing to think about. So, how can we, then you start thinking about, okay, so what is the word, or what is the suggestion? I think, there's a lot to be said for like interested, maybe it's an interested party, maybe it's a community partner, maybe it's maybe you actually have to uncouple like that group of stakeholders to, we're specifically talking about donors, board members. I think what we kind of heard throughout this whole process is the more specific you can be, the better, right? So we get into like a word like BIPOC that they suggested for retirement. We say that all the time, but they were saying sometimes that creates like a group of folks when we really mean to say Black, or we really mean to say Latino, or, so it's like kind of getting away from like grouping people because it's easy, and really like being more specific and saying what we mean.
Yeah. Yeah, I've sat through a lot of discussions about, right, the phraseology that we use, particularly in EEOC classifications, when we talk about race, when we talk about ethnicity, and, a lot of times those phrases even are used synonymously, but they're not the same. And that could be a whole separate podcast that we talk about that topic. But I think, for folks who are listening, I think some people, you'll hear them use the word Black, and then other folks will use the word African American. And the reality is that for any given person, one of those phrases, right, may be offensive to them individually. It's I feel like it's no different than anything else. We've got to stop and ask ourselves, for individuals, what really matters to them as people. And sometimes we just ask, right? Like we just go out on a limb and we ask the question.
Well, I think that's the bigger learning here, is that there's lots of debate. And I think the way to avoid the debate is to be curious and ask what your preference is, right? I try to think about the words that I use as a human being. And we had a debate about Latino, Latina, and Latine. And, there are different people in the room who are of Latin descent who respond to that very differently. And there's so much subcontext as it relates to culture in the Latino community. So it's like, if you are Puerto Rican versus Dominican, if you're from Spain, if you are from South America, how you fit into that space and what you want to be identified with is very different. There's a really large, large not the right word. There's a powerful culture, especially in the Puerto Rican culture. So there's this word in Spanish called, it's said orgullo. And that word means pride. But it is one of those words that in the Puerto Rican culture has like quadruple extra oomph to it. And when you think about a Puerto Rican that's from New York versus a Puerto Rican that's from the island, there are some things that are differentiators there. But being Puerto Rican by itself creates that sense of orgullo that is like, you can't tell me nothing about nothing. These are my people, right? And they would much rather say, I'm Boricua versus I'm Latino. That's not what's going to happen in Puerto Rican culture. So it's interesting that we've got to just ask and be curious. I think the challenge with that is that, no one wants to get it wrong. No one wants to be in a debate, right? Well, maybe some people do. I don't usually want to debate people. I think it's about our heart space and our intention with our curiosity. Because am I being curious to debate with you and tell you how you're wrong about this? Or am I being curious because I actually want a different perspective and I'm trying to broaden my own understanding? We had an interesting conversation with an advisory group that's part of our Crispus Attucks Community Center, which was a historically Black community center. It was basically a refuge for the Black community here. It's almost 100 years old in Lancaster County. It has been, and it's right in the southeast part of the city. It has been kind of a cornerstone institution in the Southeast, but it was also a place where during the time of segregation, the things that Black people needed came out of the center. Clinic, after school program, cheerleading, meals, anything that community needed, they had to find refuge in a different place to receive it. And the center was that. So as we were talking to kind of two different generations of people who are really care about the center deeply, the older generation of folks were saying, no, it's African American. And the younger generation was saying it's Black. And there was a lot more willingness to explore Black as a diaspora, where, the folks who are a little older are like, no, it's African American, and there's an African American experience here that they're not willing to negotiate that, because the lived experience of African people that were kidnapped and brought to this country, and then their ancestors and how they experienced America, what they got to was a place of saying, we are African American, and that feels whole for them. And then a younger generation is like, it's cool, we're Black, whether you're from Haiti or you're from South Carolina. And it was just a different dialogue, but it was really interesting. And we ended up working it out that we could use both terms in the way that we talk about the work. So when we talk about the history of Crispus Attucks, we talk about it through the lens of the African American experience. And then as we talk about the future of the center, we talk about the Black experience. So we were able to hold space for both of them, but we had to show up with a lot of curiosity to be like, what's this tension about these words? Because it was very clear, and they were very quick to be like, not that word for me, not that word for me.
Yeah, it's one of the, I think this is something that is always, this discussion is something that always intrigues me to kind of dig into, because I think in American culture, we sort of have this requirement almost, right? Well, we do have a requirement. We have to check a box, and which box we check is so ingrained in our brains. And so when we think about who we are, what makes up our identities, right? How we see each other, how we see our community, quote unquote, right? Like it becomes very much like you only fit in this box, and you only fit in this box. You don't fit in this box, even though everybody fits in lots of boxes. And ultimately, anybody who was at our summit last year, we had Clint Smith come and speak. And he, has this great book called How the Word is Passed. If you haven't read it, read it. If you need a copy and you're a CAAP member, let me know. I got some extra copies sitting in my office. But he talks about, right, so much of how we see the world, so much of how we see other people is really ingrained in how we were brought up, right? And to unbox that is complicated, and it makes people uncomfortable, to your point earlier, Vanessa, right? And it's hard to have discussion about, because people immediately feel it feels like you're poking at my insides, right? And it bothers people. But I think the word that you use, right, about curiosity and trying to seek to understand is part of what I try to always speak about, right? Like it's ultimately, at the end of the day, for me, people just need to be treated as humans, and understanding how they want to be treated is at its core. That's complicated to unbox, but it's not that complicated. Ultimately, everybody deserves to be treated with human decency and respect. And part of why you did this, right, is to be able to do that. I mean, it's kind of that simple. It's complicated work, but it's kind of that simple in my mind.
I don't mean to get all scripture, because I don't know scripture, but isn't it like do unto thy neighbor, right, as you would want done to yourself? That's it. Kindness and compassion and empathy really isn't that hard. It is a choice. It's a choice when your baby's screaming and the coffee spilled on your shirt and the traffic's jammed and the casework doesn't stop and this and that. I get it. But boy, I'll tell you what, after doing this for a while, it is going to have such an incredible impact. How long have you initiated this new concept?
So, I mean, we started the engagement like a year and a half ago. So we're actually still in the process of, so what we've done since it's wrapped up, we got a report, right? So the Wakeman Agency put all of this information into a report for us, with like a suggested glossary of terms and that sort of thing. So then we went back to, internal folks and said, okay, what is right for us in CAAP, CAAP in Lancaster, because not everything fit perfectly. And so kind of had those conversations. We have a DEI task force here at CAAP. So we threw by them an executive summary that we developed. And actually what was so fascinating to come out of that conversation was two things. Number one, the word lexicon is not super accessible. So what is a lexicon?
most people don't. It's like etymology. If you say etymology, people are like, what is an etymology? How do I, it's, and, study of words, how they came to be, lexicon, not a word that people typically
etymology
use.
was soybeans. Oh. Okay.
Right, exactly. Right. As a former English teacher, words I all, had to spend a lot of time in class about.
So needing, through that feedback, no, that's great. I mean, through that feedback, we were like, okay, so we really need to define lexicon. I mean, listen, the lexicon project is trademarked. So we also need to do that. But we can certainly give a definition of what a lexicon is, because really it's just a vocabulary of a people, right? So this is the vocabulary of CAAP, is what this is going to be. And, the other thing that was interesting is, I put together the executive summary from, the report we got, and folks were like, yeah, this language, throw this through something to see who this is written for, grade wise, right? We try to write to a certain grade level, and it came back and it was collegiate. So I was like, okay, well, that's also not super accessible. So I used our friend ChatGPT, and they made it, they brought it down to a 5th, 6th grade level, and it made it so much more accessible and frankly, just easier to understand. I think, so it's very interesting to think about even a project meant to create more accessibility in language, still, it still had work that needed to be done to make it accessible. So it's never rest and never sleep on it, because, there's always something to reconsider. I think we will be reconsidering, for the rest of time.
Brene Brown said it best: clarity is kind. And in marketing, you have to be clear, not clever. Be clear. And, every marketing book and every marketer out there worth their weight in gold is going to tell you drop it to that 5th or 6th grade level, because that is just the easiest, the best consumable way, and tell a lot of stories. But what I'd love to know is, with change comes growing pains. Did we have anybody who was like, what is this? What is this?
Oh, for sure.
That's the space. Yes.
And here's the thing. I think there were, even when, probably a few years ago, I remember we hosted an all staff and we had different tracks of learning. So we did kind of our plenary together as a team. And then we were like, every year we try to come up with a different way that we approach all staff. It's our one time of year that we get all 300 people in the room together. And we try to, hold that touch point. And one year we're like, oh, we're going to do these learning tracks, and people can register for what they're interested in. And I remember that, it was virtual, it was during COVID times, we were doing our best. And some folks didn't get the track that they originally had requested. They got bumped into another Zoom room. And there was some hesitation because they were bumped into, I think we were doing one around language justice with a partner, local partner was doing that one. We were doing one with the LGBTQ coalition, and then I can't remember what the other tracks were. So folks got bumped into that LGBTQ track, and they were kind of like, no, I don't want to be, that's not what I signed up for. And I was like, okay, well, you're going to have to rock with it and learn something, and be flexible. But I remember getting feedback for folks feeling like, why that we were doing too much in the DEI space, or, they didn't appreciate the different kind of learning structures. And I talk with people about that of like, hey, it's really hard for me to consider how we can be really impactful in our work if we aren't willing to be learners. Right. So there's this work by this gentleman named Dr. Nicholas Hobbs, who was a youth development person, and he had these 12 core principles of learning. And he was all about his whole philosophy was like, every kid can relearn. No kid is damaged, broken, bad. We can all relearn. And one of the core principles that he had was that we were all teachers and we're all learners. And I've been, working with this team to say, we got to be open to teaching and learning. It doesn't matter what position you're in. We have to hold the posture of a teacher and a learner. And sometimes we've got to say like, oh, I'm the teacher. I bring something to this conversation that can help. And sometimes we got to be like, wow, I got to just be open to learning. And it doesn't mean that I'm asking you to be the practitioner about that thing that we're teaching, but I need you to be part of our team from a place of like, hey, I'm willing to explore. Because that's the only way that we evolve as humans, if we're willing to learn. So we have definitely had a long history of folks who really, are trying to come along, but push and pull on it, which is fair and fine for them to do. And it's also up to them to decide if this is like the right place for them. I try to lead from a very centrist place. We try to minimize the politics of things and really keep it to the human experience. But I also recognize that for some people, there are things that just feel like buzzwords that they can't get past, or they feel forced in a way. And I will deal with those things on a case-by-case basis as they come up. I want to be able to have a dialogue with people before they make that decision, to step away from the organization or to be frustrated with us. I want them to engage in a conversation. But we definitely have people who I think have been curious about, like, why are we doing all this? How does it do with our work? And that gives me the opportunity to like walk them back and say, this is why I think it's important. And every leader has an opportunity to set their own vision and approach to the work. I'm leading now, and this is the way that I choose to lead. 15 years, someone else might lead in a different way and have different priorities. That's totally okay.
Yeah. Well, I think to this end, it's part of what I talk when I talk about my own experience, which I speak about fairly often. It's one of the things I say, like, I'm not telling you about who I am because I'm trying to change your opinion. You can think whatever you want about the way that I live my life and who I am on the inside. At the end of the day, though, if I work with you, you better darn well treat me with respect, right? Like you would anybody else. You don't have to. We can agree to disagree and have healthy discourse. That's fine. So I also think about it from that perspective, right? Like, again, with community action, I'll kind of, bring this back to what we do in our day-to-days. You all far so more than I do, because I just get to talk about it most days. Right? I'm not direct client service, but if our job is to create equity in our communities and understand the needs of our communities, we have to understand the needs of our communities. And that means the needs of the, in totality, particularly the diverse nature of your all's county, right? That's the way it is. So the reality is, the communities that you've trained about, you've had folks speak about, that's part of your population that you serve. So you've got to ensure that your team understands needs and uses phrases, words, right? Lexicon, if you will, that creates the spirit of inclusion and what you're trying to accomplish at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I think for us, because we have so many different programs at our local CAAP, our customer does look different and requires something different from those touch points. So we provide domestic violence services for victims and survivors of domestic violence in all of Lancaster County. We're the one focused agency on DV. And there is a lot of language in that work that, Kristy and I have to be really intentional about learning and understanding, because it's not the work that we're doing every day, but we have to be really clear about it, because when we are talking to donors or, sponsors, or we're trying to, have the right language in a grant application, we want to make sure that we're attuned to what is appropriate for that space versus how we talk about food insecurity. I grew up in a low income situation as a kid. My mom was on public assistance and, did what she needed to do to support 3 kids and all those things. I don't often talk about people as poor people. I often will say people living in low income conditions. So I try to and I don't get it right all the time. There's times where a thing will slip. I'll be like, catch me later on that one. I don't, another one was grandfathered. I was like, oh my gosh, how do you then what do you say about that? What's the alternative? So sometimes I'll be at a meeting with Kristy. I'm like, what's the other thing that we're supposed to say now? That's not that thing, but you know what I mean? When it's and she'll give me the words. But it's not easy. And I will tell you, it's not about being perfect. It's about just committing to the progress of learning.
Yeah.
Listen, every time you swing, you're not going to get a hit, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I love baseball. It's law of averages. You're trying to get the higher average, but you can only do that in school, which is the real world. Yeah. So, ease and grace as you're going through this. Yeah, Kristy.
And it's funny because, Vanessa, that's a great example of poor people versus either people living with low income or experiencing low income conditions or whatever it is. So what you're talking about is not modifying them by their experience or their circumstance, but rather, putting them first as a human, and then this is maybe a circumstance. What I think I struggle with is I come from a background as a journalist where I always needed to use fewer words, not more. And now in my current role, even in grant applications, you have 500 characters. Like, people experiencing low income conditions is a lot more, has a lot more.
It's a good point.
And
but you have chat.
we love her. But yeah, so I mean, we had a whole conversation about that at our leadership level of like, oh, this is a lot of words. It's like, yeah, sometimes it's going to be a lot of words, and maybe eventually we can, somehow condense what that is. But until we know that, like, let's use more words, because the harm, I don't know that there's harm in using more words rather than fewer. So I think that idea of just, how can we cause the least harm possible, is really something to keep at the forefront.
Yeah, and I would agree too. Just to consider is that we also are having to make real-time decisions. I think this grant example is one that's smart to consider. Our heart and our commitment could be like, we're using all the words all the time. And then we get to a grant, we're like, we got to say poor people because we need this thing to fit in this one sentence, right? So it's also, you have to create a level, I think, of flexibility that doesn't feel like you're backing away from, the commitment, the expectation. And that's a hard space to be in because, and I think about folks who are like, the social warrior justice person who's like saying all the right words all the right time. And, and that's great, but it's also, we've got to, I think to your point, Heather, it's like, we got to give room and grace for the learning and to say like, I got to do this thing here until I can figure out how to fix it in the future. My commitment is to figure out how to fix it in the future. So by doing that thing doesn't mean that I've totally abandoned what I think is important about that.
Well, and I think thinking about our work, I think for however many years, for almost 60 years, we've discussed this work as anti-poverty work. And I think what we've been trying to do is really position it more as prosperity work. So what I've adopted saying is like, we're an anti-poverty agency, or as we like to consider it, pro-prosperity. Would I like to just say pro-prosperity? Sure, but no one knows what that means. So let's not be intentionally confusing to make a point. Let's call people in, and then, and every time I say that, people like give very knowing looks. So maybe in the future, once we've educated folks, that will be a reality. But
yeah, right. Y'all are thought leaders here too with your language, saying pro, what was it? Pro prosperity. Yes. And the more you say it,
pro prosperity.
Yeah, right. My bad. I'll get it. But that's it. You are educating us and you're leading us as leaders do. Leaders got to lead. Now, I do have a question. I am imagining, and go ahead, Beck.
No, I was just going to say, I just want to add to what Kristy just said a second ago, which is that also people are already confused about what we do and have misconceptions of what we do within community action. I mean, we have there's, over 1,000 community action agencies across the country. Not everyone has community action in title and name. Some are embedded in local county, which means that some are public, some are nonprofit. You have, local community needs being considered. This is my soapbox. Anybody who's in community action is going to hear this ramble and be like, yeah, Beck, yes. Right. We're addressing local community needs, which means the way in which everybody does that is very different and the approach looks different. And even within one county, the approach changes from zip code to zip code. So, we're already complicated. And so to try to change the words that we use with our community who already doesn't understand us is just an added complication to an already overwhelming, what sometimes feels like to me, an overwhelming branding issue that we have. So for not for nothing, but we'll just say that out loud. I'm done now, Heather, go ahead.
That's amazing. Well, you teed it up perfectly. It's like, I imagine that this is having ripple effects on other areas, not just website copy, but, has this initiated or inspired any other culture or equity movements within Lancaster CAAP?
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, it's figuring out how do we put things into practice. One of the things that I challenged myself and our team to consider is that, we have been really committed to creating access to learning. And I am saying, show me where the application is happening. So that's kind of where we are, I think, as a team. It's like, okay, we've done a lot of learning over the last 5 years. We've poured in a lot of professional development and a lot of, mindset and, all the things. Like, it's like, now, how do we get into the practice of doing the thing that we learned? And how much of that can really be soaked into the day, to the day's experience. So I would say right now, our commitment is really around, like, how do we figure out how this becomes more like, this is our practice of these things. How do they align to our values? How do they show up in our work? I don't want to lead us on a journey of spending lots of, dollars, resource, and time on all this learning, and there's no application to that learning. And then without application, there's no transformation. So, I think we got to pause a little and say, like, okay, we've done a lot of learning over the last few years. Let's think about what our application looks like. And then we can come back and say, where have we made progress in this space? What has changed that we have to pay attention to? And then, like, okay, now we'll have to do some more learning. I think it should be probably a very circular process. I think that's just kind of where we are. I don't know, Kristy, if you would agree with, the application piece.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, especially, I think when you look at specifically at this project, like, the next step following, like, the glossary is the fact that this glossary is a living document. And so there's also going to be a process created where folks anywhere in the organization can submit a new word to be considered, that we can talk about, we can research, we can do that whole thing. We can take things out of the glossary. It's always, you think about even just over the past, couple decades. I mean, there are words we're not using anymore, and for good reason. And so, I think that idea of living, proactivity can be applied to so many other things that we're doing, especially things that are process oriented. And so I think that can become like almost an element of culture that touches this project, but that can touch other projects as well.
Yeah. So I know that we're coming up on our time here, and I want to be respectful of your all's time, and it's, about time to end our time together. So want to make sure to just say, is there anything else that either one of you want to share about the impact of what this has been personally, professionally, anything else that you haven't shared? And I also just want to give a shout out to CAAP Blank for folks who are listening, right? You don't know about the organization, check them out on the website, caapblank.org. Would really encourage you to think about, right, how you can share time, resources. That can be volunteering, that can be dollars, lots of other ways, connecting to other folks who are in the community. But please, or you can also go to the caap.org and go to our member section and check them out and research specific to Lancaster County. So, but anything else that you want to share specific to?
I think the only other thing I would say is, like, we are enthusiastic about continuing this conversation and broadening it beyond just our organization, right? So whether or not that's other CAAPs in the Commonwealth, whether or not that's other nonprofits, whoever it is, would love to just continue the conversation, because I feel like this work will only really be, not that it won't matter, but it will matter for the community, the broader it's adopted and the broader it's thought about. And I think, especially for folks outside the organization, like, just thinking about, right, how does this maybe apply to you? And maybe it doesn't at all, but, like, I would love to just, continue the conversation and see what other people are thinking, and, help inform us help inform other folks, and just make it like, something that can kind of go across and touch anyone in Lancaster County or beyond.
Yeah. And the only thing I add is, one is a lot of gratitude for Kristy. This was kind of her passion project that she, really advocated to figure out how we would resource and for us to do. She has, worked through a lot of her own learning, in the role that she has and in coming to the organization. So I think this is one of the kind of the fruits of her labor. And I just want to make sure that folks, that she knows that I appreciate that about her, and that it's been a deep joy to see her kind of gravitate towards the space and own it and be, what many, especially as a person of color, it's really great to have, white counterparts who are willing to hold space, in these kinds of conversations, to be the bridge and to be part of the learning. So just a lot of gratitude for Kristy, as she's kind of led this work. And I think for us is just to, we're in an interesting time, where language is, really kind of being challenged in lots of ways. And, we're trying to be really thoughtful about how do we ensure that our services are available to the community that we serve, and that we can hold true to who we are as an organization. Sometimes those two things feel, in tension with one another. So just a point of encouragement to those of you who are part of the CAAP community or who are part of any service, related role that you're just trying to make your communities better. Just keep your heads up. We're going to figure out, what the next iteration will be, but our words will matter, and they'll matter in times of the present, but they'll matter in history. So just be encouraged.
No, absolutely. I appreciate you saying that. And I also want to just echo what Vanessa, you said a minute ago, because I've worked with Kristy in other environments outside of CAAP. And, Kristy, you're always somebody that I think of as a true ally in lots of different ways. So appreciate you standing up for others and, making sure to invite people to the table, be at the table, all the things. So I want to shout you out for that. And Vanessa, just, for you, right, we'll say, I always appreciate you asking hard questions and not being scared of digging into a project like this that could feel really overwhelming, right? And just, I think perspective from team and having to navigate that, it just adds another complication to your point, right? About this may not feel like a project in light of all of the other things that are happening, but ultimately it really does create really important impact for your organization and establishes a culture norm for what the organization cares about.
Yeah.
So I appreciate both of your time today. Thank you for spending some time with Heather and I. Heather, any other questions that you have before we wrap today?
Just a comment. This has been a master class in the future and possibility. And so just Vanessa, Kristy, thank you for bringing this to light. This work is so incredibly important and critical and crucial to our future. So you're leading the way, sis. So keep it up, both of you. Thank you so much.
I need Heather to be at my house to get
every day.
So good.
Look,
not for nothing. I am for hire. Just saying.
Oh my gosh, good to know.
Good. Almost every episode, I feel like we talk about this. Like Heather is the ultimate hype person. I feel like she drinks half calf, which if you're a listener, you already know.
I do.
I drink like 4 double espressos a day. I still am tired. I don't know what is happening. But yeah, if you need a hype person out there, anybody, Heather Holloway, she's for hire.
HH, Heather Hype. Yeah. Appreciate you all. Thank you so much for doing this work. Yeah.
Thanks everybody for listening. Thank you for hanging out with us. Put it on your thinking cap. We'll catch you on the next episode.
Bye.
Bye everybody.
Bye.
Thank you for being a part of this episode of The Thinking Cap. Check the show notes for resources and links to other episodes. And don't forget to subscribe and follow to be notified when new episodes are released. If you have any community action questions you'd like Beck or one of our local experts to answer in a future episode, please email your questions about community action to info@thecap.org. Subject line, Thinking Cap.